Pleasure to invite my colleague, Rabbi Monica Kleinman, who is our Director of Lifelong Learning, to share words of Torah with all of us this morning. Rabbi Kleinman.
Walking around each other. Good morning and Shana Tova. So if the Torah portion we just heard had read like a script or a play for a movie, if it was all staged out, it would be really, really short. So it is all action and very little dialogue. The whole thing is a mere 19 verses long, and we only read about half of that this morning. From the introduction to Abraham and Isaac returning home after the ordeal is done. While the actions Abraham undertakes are deliberate and dramatic, the observer, or us, the reader, receives no clue as to what's going on in his mind. It's merely simple action after simple action that we watch. Vayash came, he got up. Vayikach, he took. He looked up. And there's a couple short conversations, most memorably the one between Abraham and Isaac about the nature of the sacrifice itself. But the story is so sparse, it is so riveting. It's supposed to make us sit on the edge of our seats with anticipation. And these silences, these unknowns, this very terse nature, are supposed to serve as rhetorical devices. So even though our people have been reading this text on Rosh Hashanah for thousands of years now, it seems like every time we are in shock when we hear God's ask, and we're scared for Isaac's life. Spoiler alert, Isaac is fine. But as we progress through the story, we're not supposed to know that. If we had a magic remote control that could pause the story every few words. Now, I do realize the irony that everybody at home could pause every few words. But that aside, if we could pause the story and stop for a moment, we would ask all sorts of questions about what is missing from this story, why it's so short, why we don't hear this information that we think we should have. Especially what's going through Abraham's mind as he goes through this ordeal, and what else might be going unrecorded throughout the story. Firstly, one question we might ask is, what kind of ask is God making of someone? Now, we all home at know it's a test, but obviously Abraham doesn't. So he finds himself in this bizarre and abominable situation, one he did not ask for, by the way, and now he has to figure out how to respond? That's a lot of questions for the first line of God tested Abraham. So I dare say that all of us have been thrown into odd situations in the last 18 months that not only did we not ask for, we're also struggling to understand. Setting aside the debate about the veracity of science, which is a sentence I never thought I would have to say out loud, we are all struggling in our own ways to explain what sometimes really feels unexplainable. But our story from Torah this morning, however, has been around for thousands of years and has had plenty of people chiming in to explain what's going on. The 11th century French commentator Rosh is known for his simple and straightforward explanations of Torah texts. So this seems like exactly what we need. We need someone who has simple and straightforward explanations to tell us what's going on. He'll give us simple answers, right? Well, yes and no. Rashi takes this very terse language and fills it up with illustrative conversations inspired by Midrash, internal monologues, and deep backstories that were inspired by other Jewish texts. As a reader like any other, he's confused too at the lack of details that this text provides, and also seeks to fill in all these plot holes. When the text says, in the very beginning it says, and after these things, Rashi reasonably responds, what things? And he supplies a story about Abraham from a midrash to fill in the gap. Clearly, this is the story that must have fit in this spot. When the text says, take your son, your only son, the one you love, Isaac. Rashi reads it as a conversation between God and Abraham. God says, take your son. And Abraham responds, well, I have two sons. Your only son. Well, each one of my sons is the only child of his mother, the one you love. I love both of them. And eventually God just gets exasperated and spells it out for him. We're talking about Isaac here. All this back and forth isn't really necessary for us to understand the plot, but Rashi can't help himself. There are so many unanswered questions. So here's another one. The place where they're supposed to go is one that God says, I will show you. The narrative tells us that after 3 days, they arrived at Moriah. This inspires a logical question. How did Abraham know that that's where they were supposed to end up? I mean, it's a logical question. So Rashi explains that there was a cloud to indicate where Abraham should stop. Well, of course there's a cloud. That's how you would know. But the text doesn't tell us that. But Rashi really needed to fill in that plot hole. How about this one? Abraham tells his two servants that he and Isaac are going to go up to the mountain to pray, and after that they'll come back. For all we know, Abraham thinks he's going up there with his son and is planning to come back alone. How could he have blatantly lied to his servants? One could argue that telling them the true plan would alarm them and cause the servants to potentially grab Isaac and try to save his life. Or he just didn't want the servants to come with them, so he told a little half-truth to get them to stay behind. No, those aren't good enough for Rashi. Rashi explains that Abraham had had a prophecy, so he knew before he even ascended the mountain that they would somehow both return. This is not to say that Rashi is just making stuff up. His work draws on a millennia of Jewish texts, and he takes advantage of these silences as opportunities to insert them into the greater narrative. That is, using the text that already exists to answer the questions that the story leads us to ask. It is easy to think that he and many other commentators are potentially uncomfortable with these silences, uncomfortable with the context of the story, and even anxious to fill in the places where the story is lacking. More universally, we can understand that when there are unknowns, people often try to fill in the silence with whatever information they have available. I cannot think of a time filled with more silence and unknown than the last year and a half. There's been a lot of inaction. There's been a lot of staying put. A couple big actions, like a vaccine, yay. And a lot of jibber-jabbering about all of it. While pandemics of the past have been recorded in diaries, this one will live forever on social media. Which has social media been truly a blessing and a curse during this last year and a half. I've been able to connect with colleagues around the country and around the world to share information about and discuss professional approaches to this strange situation we find ourselves in. It's been a source of humor. A friend began posting each day back last March on adventures without daycare and chronicled all the things his toddler demanded of him. Some of them were heartwarming and some of them were just very strange. There was time and ways to reconnect with friends now that everyone was in a similar situation in life. With all of us doing similar, simple actions, baking sourdough bread, binging on our streaming services, just kind of hanging out, the activity in our world ground to a halt. What were once everyday activities now became potentially life-threatening situations. But with this cessation of activity came an explosion in talking, that is rather typing. So one of the downsides of social media during a pandemic, everybody has a voice, and they can use that voice to say whatever they want, and often there is an audience willing to listen. After the initial shock of shutdown, the voices came out, and they were often not kind. Blame for every problem fell on the shoulders of anyone who caught the ire of a tweeter or blogger with some extra time and energy. Instead of being authority figures who presented vetted information, public figures just became regular users with a check mark next to their name. and they've had their accounts flooded with everything from criticism to praise. And when these public figures are just a click away while sitting in your bedroom or your bathroom, our guard can come down and our words can let loose. This struggle to fill the silence with something is not unusual, unique, or even inexcusable. It's human nature to want to disrupt the awkward. Kohelet, the book of Ecclesiastes, even tells us, and we sang earlier, there's a time for silence and a time for speaking. And we needed that advice before Twitter even existed. But sometimes what we forget is that it's not only the intended recipient who reads our public postings, but often our friends, family, colleagues, perhaps a future employer, perhaps your rabbis. What was once could have been a verbal outburst for which we could apologize and move on has now become a permanent mark of our emotions. Once you put it on the internet, it's there forever for everyone to see. Just as we've made assumptions about Rashi and his anxiety about the Torah portion we read this morning, people are very quick to judge us for our comments online. We may sit here every Yom Kippur and vow not to be so judgmental in the coming year, but some of it is just human instinct. It helps us identify dangerous situations and get out of them. But sometimes on social media, though, we dig ourselves deeper and deeper and deeper. I believe the saying goes, it is better to remain silent and thought of as a fool than to open your mouth and remove all doubt. And sometimes when it's really quiet, we want to open our mouths, especially when it's silent. And so these silences are not the only, Rashi's not the only one to observe these silences that we've been talking about. Basing her comments on 2,000 years of Jewish scholarship, the 20th century scholar Nechama Leibowitz, she synthesizes for us that the sparse details of this story and the relative lack of dialogue help contribute to the miraculousness of the whole ordeal. What isn't said could be where God is acting in the background. The sparse details help enhance the wondrousness of the story. In other words, less is more. God clearly listened to Kohelet and knew when to be quiet. That takes a lot of tact on God's part to hide what God was doing, even though that God knew it would ultimately end up well for Abraham. Since we have the full narrative in front of us, those 19 verses, we know what happens at the end. With that knowledge, it's easy to try to read meaning into someone's words, actions, or lack thereof. It all fits together in a nice story arc. And at the end, Abraham and Isaac walk home together. But what happens when we don't know how the story will end? I think of this every election year with the anticipation leading up to November. While some years we have more clues than others, ultimately we don't know who will win the required number of electoral votes and become the next president. We sit in limbo for hours, even days, knowing there will be an end, and we are just waiting for that end to arrive. Once all the votes are counted, it's definite, in most years. But what happens, though, if we don't know if the story will end? Will we ever be in a post-COVID world? Will we ever return to things the way we knew them before March of 2020? Will eating in a restaurant ever feel the same again? As much as you're hoping that I have an answer, I'm afraid I don't. But what I do know is that the pandemic has changed how we communicate. People who used to congregate in person and have lively debates in their living rooms now hold those conversations online for the world to see. What used to be just between friends lives on Facebook eternally. Even if you think you deleted a comment, a screenshot is forever. We can't all be like God and orchestrate the world from beginning to end. We have to live through it. Not only do we have to live through it in real time, we also have to live with the fact that we don't know ultimately what's going to happen. There's no shortage of people who claim to have that answer, and they certainly do make a lot of noise. I believe that noise, this excess of arguing and talking, comes from our anxiety about the current state of the world. which is an absolutely reasonable explanation. We're all entitled to feel anxious, sad, mad, exasperated, or worried. But when we look back on the written record of this time, whenever that moment of reflection comes, what do we want people to think of our character as echoed in our status updates? Do we want to appear as bellicose and harsh towards those with whom we disagree? Is our online legacy one of which we can be proud? I'm not suggesting that we all refrain from engaging in dialogue, far from it. But as we embark on this new year, I challenge each of us to stop and think before hitting post. Maybe our silence, in some cases, can help contribute to healthier and more thoughtful communication in our overly saturated world. Shana Tova.